It was a beautiful morning down on the south side as Pitt football opened up its 2025 spring camp. Welcome into the Pittsburgh Sports Now Football Pulse. I'm Nathan Brysinger, bringing you full coverage of the Pitt Panthers across spring camp through the summer and entering the 2025 season. And for Pitt, it was the start today of another season, 11th year under head coach Pat Narduzzi, and it's coming off a season that they started very promising. 7-0 start and then faltered at the end, losing their last 6 games, including a bowl loss to Toledo. And feels like it was months ago, but really not that long ago, and they're back on the field for spring camp. A lot to dive into. We'll have you covered here on the Pittsburgh Sports Now Football Pulse, bringing you weekly episodes just discussing Pitt, a lot of different topics surrounding the team, especially here in camp where there's a lot of questions still to be answered. So today on this first episode, we're going to talk about a couple of different things, especially regarding the offense. But the first thing we want to get into and is exactly what head coach Pat Narduzzi got into in his press conference and was the lone topic during his first presser of spring camp was the death and tragic accident of Pitt freshman cornerback Mason Alexander. Such a sad story. We broke that just over a week ago after we learned from news outlets in Indianapolis, Indiana, about the death of Mason Alexander in a car accident. And it's been already a week and a couple days since that has happened. Pat Narduzzi released a statement online, regarding the death of Mason Alexander. But this was the first week that the entire Pitt team was back together. They were on spring break last week, part of when Mason was home back in Fishers, Indiana, which led to that accident. But it was the first day that this team was together yesterday and today. Pat Narduzzi just talked about how everyone is still mourning the loss, very closely. Very tough on this team. And out of respect, he took the entire press conference, didn't want to talk anything about football, what happened in the first spring camp, because, again, we have a lot of questions in the media, but Pat Narduzzi, again, out of respect, wanted to talk about Mason Alexander, what he meant to this program. Just in the short amount of time, he was an early enrollee, was only on campus for 2 months before the tragic accident, and now he will forever be remembered in the Pitt football program. And this team will honor him throughout the season. And was asked, was the energy different just because maybe there's a little bit more motivation because of this? And Pat Narduzzi was like, yes, but it's a tragic moment, and there's going to be different ways to deal with this, and players are mourning it differently, coping with it differently. So it's still very raw down there on the south side, inside that Pitt facility, as they deal with the loss of a young life. And we talked to him, the media talked to Mason Alexander just 3 days before the accident. And my takeaway, he seemed just like a bright man, knew what he was talking about, just had the words for everything. He really thought out, very thoughtful of what he was talking about, and it seemed like that kid was going to be going on to potentially be a leader in this program. That's just the feeling I got from him as he stood up there at the podium in the South Side, and it's just a life lost too soon. And Pat Narduzzi, talked about he'll be a Panther forever, and they'll find a way to honor him throughout the season in the fall, but right now they're still dealing with it. Pat Narduzzi talked about on March 25th is the expected date for Mason Alexander's funeral services, and it's a Tuesday, which during the spring camp, Pitt practices Tuesdays and Thursdays, along with some weekend dates, but they will take that date off, allowing players and coaches alike to go out and travel to Indianapolis to pay their final respects and mourn as a group, to honor and the loss of Mason Alexander. So that was very, very touching of Pat Narduzzi. All questions were directed towards Mason Alexander and just what he meant to this program. So, of course, there's a lot to talk about when it comes to the on-field play, a lot of different positional battles, as we'll get into that now. And I think the big thing, though, we want to talk about briefly is Eli Holstein's back. He looks healthy. He left last year, was banged up in a handful of games, but ultimately his season was done for. During the Louisville game, he left and wore a boot for the remainder of the season, including in the bowl game. Did not play there. And we saw David Lynch and Julian Duggar play out the remainder of the season, along with Nagy Arnell, who's no longer with the program, transferring to Texas State. So currently right now, there are 4 quarterbacks on roster and that are at spring camp right now. Compared to last year, there were 6 quarterbacks. And with the losses of Nate Yarnell, Ty Diefenbach, who's out at Cal Poly, and Jake Frantel, another walk-on quarterback, Pitt is down to 4 guys right now with Eli Holstein, Julian Duggar, David Lynch, and Mason Heinschel, the early enrollee freshman. So it'll be interesting to see the developments behind Eli Holstein. He looks healthy. He's throwing the ball really well, getting in his first couple of reps of spring camp. Now, Julian Duggar had a really good end to his season last year. He really did a good job of kind of locking up that backup role. We'll see how he performs throughout spring camp here. Obviously, you have the rest of the summer into fall camp, so there's a lot to go right now, but it'll be between Duggar and David Lynch, the walk-on from last year that got some playing time, to see who ultimately backs up Eli Holstein. And then also we'll see the development of Mason Heinschel. And Pitt will have currently a preferred walk-on who should join and is expected to join the Panthers over the summer, and Bo Jackson, a Michigan native who committed a few weeks ago. So he'll join the Panthers. The Pitt should have 5 quarterbacks come the start of the 2025 season, but as of now, just 4. And Holstein, again, he looks good. Mobility was good, moving the ball around, throwing it around as they continue through their passing drills. Now, one of the biggest storylines coming into this season is how does Pitt replace the production of Konate Mumfield, who steps in as that secondary outside receiver across from Kenny Johnson. Kenny Johnson looks good. He's entering his junior season, has played since a true freshman here at Pitt, and he played really well last year, one of the top 4 receivers on this Pitt team. He'll be their number 1. Just about locks that up for sure, and if anything happens, then that's really up to him. But on the other side, Pitt has brought in a handful of transfer wide receivers that can compete for that top job. I wrote about it on PittsburghSportsNow.com. And I watched a lot of Andy Jean, the Florida transfer, and he's a little bit of a younger guy, and he looks the part of Konate Mumfield in terms of just the skill he has, the route running ability. He's pretty crisp when he's running those routes out there in practice. And, still rusty, of course. It's day 1. There's a lot of rust. Incomplete passes to receivers. So still working on those. But Andy Jean, he wears 14, which is what Mumfield wore originally when he first came over to Pittsburgh from Akron. And he just looks like a guy that can really be a threat on the outside in terms of especially how Mumfield was able to leverage the inside middle of the field. I think Andy Jean is a guy that can do that as well. Now, along with him, you have Sincere Lee, who left last year with an injury, ended the season with an injury, I should say. He'll be back, fighting for that other outside job, along with the other 2 transfers. Deuce Spann is a 6'4" guy. Didn't watch a ton of him today. Watch a little bit more of him on Thursday and in the coming weeks just to see what he brings to the table. But he's tall, he's lengthy. He can be a nice outside threat along the sideline. I expect him to be a red zone target as well, just with the frame he has and the catch radius that he possesses. And then Kateris Blue Hicks, if you want to call him, but the coaching staff is high on him, coming into this spring camp. The Louisville transfer had just over 10 catches last year for 150 or so yards for the Cardinals as a redshirt freshman. So he was early on making an impact as a freshman for the Cardinals. He left the program, told us that he knew during the bowl game back in December that he was going to be leaving Louisville. So now he's here in Pittsburgh. The coaching staff wants him on the outside with his speed that he possesses. They believe that he can take the top off of defense when he has been a slot guy through the first 2 years of his career in Louisville. But when you have Raphael Poppy Williams, Tyreek Robinson in the slot as well, those type of guys, you want to have as much speed on the field at one time, as much skill. So they're going to move Hicks to the outside, let him start spring camp there and see how he develops. So very interesting to see how this wide receiver room shapes up. We're going to be watching that and monitoring that closely. We wrote about that as one of our top storylines entering camp, especially on the offensive side of the ball. Now, another key thing that we learned today down on the south side was that Pitt running back Che Wabuko, sorry. He is no longer with the team. When we get the official first roster of camp, he wasn't on the roster. And talking to a Pitt spokesperson, that he was already gone from the program at the end of last season after the bowl game. So he didn't announce anything. He's been still kind of active on social media, reposting Pitt stuff. He was a member of the Pitt track and field team. He's no longer listed on there as well. And he was going to be a depth running back. Pitt currently at spring camp, they have Desmond Reed, they have Derek Davis Jr., and Juelz Goff, along with true freshman Ja'Karian Turner. So right now, only 4 scholarship guys. They have 2 more that will come in Sinquan Smith and Jalen Brown come summer. But it's a lot of young players, especially with Desmond Reed, and then you have Juelz Goff, who played towards the end of the last season, did preserve his redshirt, so he will be a redshirt freshman, so still very young. And then Derek Davis ended last season with an injury. He's still recovering from that a bit, so we'll see how things sort of take shape here in the coming weeks. But Reed and Goff are your 1 and 2. I'd assume, obviously Reed's your number 1 guy, returning All-American specialist at that, but still one of the top 10, 15 running backs in the nation coming back for the Panthers. So Reed, Goff, along with Wabuko. And then also Justin Cook, who is a transfer wide receiver from East Stroudsburg and one of the lower divisions of college football. He was taking reps at running back, so we'll see how that develops. He's a smaller guy, stands at only 5'10", 180 pounds. He's a senior this year, so we'll see where he sort of fits in the mold within this Panthers offense. But that's a guy, we'll see how things shape up with him, where he may slot in. But we saw Wabuko, he got shifted from wide receiver. Wabuko came in as a 4-star wide receiver from Texas, and then eventually last year got moved inside to the running back position in the backfield just for his speed and what he could bring. He was also someone who was featured as a specialist at times, especially at least as a redshirt freshman in 2023. He didn't do so as much last year with Reed back there and Kenny Johnson, but I would have expected to see him a little bit in the kick return game this year if he was still on the roster. But that was news to us down on the south side today that Wabuko was no longer on the roster. So thins up again a little bit of the running back room, and it's a lot of smaller guys. Derek Davis is the biggest running back in there at 6 foot, 210 pounds. Once he's healthy, I expect him to be kind of your Daniel Carter this year. Change of pace back, a little bit bigger guy on the goal line, short yardage scenarios. And no one can forget, it could be overshadowed because just some of the other incredible plays that happened in the backyard brawl this past year. But he sealed the deal with the touchdown right along the goal line to win it basically for the Panthers. But sometimes that's overshadowed by the Holstein throw to Dejon Reynolds from 40 yards out to basically get that game tied up, or at least within a couple of points. So the running back room and the wide receiver room will be interesting, obviously outside of Desmond Reed and Kenny Johnson. And, just to wrap things up today, wanted to talk a little bit about the offensive line. We'll talk more about the defensive side of the ball coming up in a couple of days on Thursday. But Pitt has some big questions when it comes to their offensive line. They invested a lot of resources this offseason to go out and get some offensive line help. They brought in Jeff Percy from Michigan, who is a veteran guy with over 40 games of experience with the Wolverines, won a national championship, has played a ton of left guard. Most of his snaps have been on the left side, and he's 6'8". You'd want to have a guy that's standing 6'8" to block your blind side if you're a Holstein, but he's going to be challenged by Kendall Stanley, and we'll also see where Ryan Baer fits into this offensive line unit. Because Ryan Baer, he started last year right tackle, moved over to left tackle once Branson Taylor left the season with an injury. So we'll see where Baer winds up. He could go either way, but Percy, I think, could start at left tackle. Kendall Stanley played almost exclusively at right tackle in Charlotte, and an all-AAC honorable mention this past year. So obviously a solid lineman that come in. He's entering his redshirt junior season. So was Baer. But Stanley had told us that he feels more comfortable over on the left side. So it'll be very interesting development to see who takes over that left tackle job, because it's very, very important. And for Pitt's offensive line, they've struggled in the past couple of years with just play and also taking penalties and injuries. So that's going to be a huge emphasis this spring camp, is to see how that offensive line takes shape and who starts at the tackle positions. My guess would be Piercy on the left side, and I'd possibly start Bear on the right side, just from his experience within the Pitt system playing last year with Pitt. He had his ups and downs, but nonetheless, it's a good thing to have that you have three guys that can really start at the tackle position, and then you have Jackson Brown and Isaiah Montgomery beyond that, but you'd hope you don't have to reach them. So really, if they can figure out who's going to be your two starting tackles at this point in spring camp, over the next couple of weeks, would be huge for the Panthers going into the spring game. Get you an idea of what they have. Now, inside, there's a little bit more answers in there, I believe, at this point. Lyndon Cooper's going to be your starting center, barring anything happens, any injuries. Right guard will be B.J. Williams, who has continued to slowly, get better and better. He was just a sophomore last year, so another year under his belt. He played rather okay. I mean, he wasn't really a sore spot in the offensive line. It was mainly the tackles, and then the left guard with Ryan Jacoby in and out of the lineup with injuries. But now on the left side, Keith Govier from Richmond will be projected as the left guard. We'll see how, again, if he can take that. It's his last year of eligibility. He's played at Richmond for the past couple of years, so he brings some starting experience there. So Pitt's offensive line, there's a lot of shuffling pieces, especially at the tackle position, and that'll be something we're going to keep an eye on here in the coming weeks as spring camp continues to develop. But that'll do it for today's episode of the Pittsburgh Sports Now Football Pulse. Be sure to check out all of our content over on PittsburghSportsNow.com as we continue to watch and cover this Pitt football spring camp of 2025 over the next coming weeks.